Now, Paul and Barnabas, excited after their newfound validation from the council in Jerusalem, they began to start talking about their next plans for going back into the mission field. They were energetic. They had finally received full authority and support for what they thought God had been calling them to all along. But now it was from the wider church, not just the church in Antioch, but even the authorities in Jerusalem agreed to the mission work they were doing. So they began to make plans. Where were they going to go next? How were they going to support the churches that they had already planted in Galatia? And so they began to talk about where they're going to go. And in that conversation, the topic comes up of who they're going to bring along as an assistant. Barnabas, having reconnected with John Mark when they were in Jerusalem and having an affinity for the young man, begins to suggest that they take John Mark with them. But Paul has a problem with this. Now, Paul has a problem with this not just because John Mark had bailed on them in their first missionary journey, but also because John Mark is believed was a relative of Barnabas's and also of Peter's. And so we think they were cousins in some way or another. And so this incident that they had had in Antioch when Peter and Barnabas both went over to the other party of Jewish Christian believers who were demanding circumcision and demanding separation of Jews and Gentiles, when they go over to join that group and those Jewish believers, they lose a little bit of trust in Paul's mind. He looks at them as flighty or as people who weren't really committed to the gospel in the way that he was committed. So all of a sudden, as Paul thinks about the prospect of going out on the mission field with Barnabas and with John Mark, he thinks, I think, that he's going to be teamed up on and that they might cause him problems. And so a conflict arises in the relationship between Paul and Barnabas, this great team that had done such wonderful work throughout the region of Galatia before. They began to fight and disagree on this particular topic of who they should bring. So they decide to go two different directions. And this conflict, we kind of get the sense, is a little bit public, that other people knew about what was going on. And it's a little disappointment, a little frustration. And even though we'll see later that Paul comes to a point where he begins to trust John Mark, and it seems like he's reconciled with John Mark and Barnabas, there's some real tension there in the relationship for a while. Paul chooses instead a young man named Silas to come along with him. And so they leave by land and they go back up into the region of Galatia, but they leave from Antioch in Syria around kind of the Mediterranean through probably Tarsus and go off into the Galatian region in South Galatia and visit again all the churches that they had once planted together with Barnabas earlier, strengthening the believers there, giving them some new teaching, helping them to encourage them and to train new leadership. And they get to Antioch in Pisidia, and they decide that they are going to go south into Asia Minor. It might be that Paul had in his vision the entire time that he wanted to get to Ephesus, an incredibly important trade and port city on this Aegean Sea. And he might have wanted to get there so that he can begin to plant a church in this city that the gospel could spread and naturally go out from that city. And yet something happens that doesn't allow them to leave and to go southwest into Asia Minor. And the Holy Spirit keeps blocking them. And instead, one night, Paul's having a dream, a vision. He sees a Macedonian man calling him over to Macedonia, which is north above Greece. And he realizes that the Spirit is calling him to go not to Asia Minor, but instead to north of Greece and then through Greece. So Paul takes off, and they end up in the city of Lystra. In this city, they meet a young man named Timothy, whose grandmother and mother had become believers and were followers of Jesus. And yet, Timothy, being half Greek, half Jewish, had never been circumcised. And Paul immediately sees that this young man was gifted and that he should come along with him in his journeys. And so he invites Timothy to come with him, but first he tells Timothy that he should be circumcised. This may seem like a conflict to us as we see it from the outside, because it seems like Paul was fighting so hard that the new Gentile believers shouldn't be circumcised, and all of a sudden now he's saying that Timothy needs to be circumcised. But at the same time, Paul's very aware of how the perception is going to be of Timothy as they go first to the synagogue to bring the good news of Jesus and then later to the marketplace and to the Greek world. And he knows that if Timothy is going to have any shot of being accepted in those synagogues and being listened to and being the talented young minister that he is, and he needs to have this young man, Timothy, to be seen as fully Jewish and not some kind of weird in-between. And so he encourages Timothy, for the sake of the gospel, to get circumcised so that Timothy could be accepted in these places. So he does, and they head off over the North Aegean Sea into Macedonia, and they come first to a city called Philippi. And we know this city because Paul later writes a letter to the Philippian church, and that's the same city, and we can talk a lot about the city there, but it doesn't seem like there's a huge Jewish population. They don't have a synagogue as such, but they seem to have a meeting space down near the river. And so Paul goes to meet with the Jews there, and he meets a woman named Lydia. This woman was in some way or another very wealthy of her own accord. She had been in the textile industry, and she was a specialty in purple dyes, and she had gained a tremendous amount of wealth and somewhat authority. And she hears Paul's message and she believes. And so Paul immediately gets a female leadership and presence and authority figure on his side and following along with him and being a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth. At the same time, as they're there, they continue to be followed daily by this slave girl who is, as the scriptures say, was possessed by a demon. The slave girl had the ability of telling the future or telling hidden things. And the owners who owned her used it to make money. They would have her tell people's fortunes. And yet every time Paul and Silas and Timothy would walk by, you would see that the slave girl would follow after them and would yell, "I know who you are. I know who you are." And at some point, Paul really gets sick of this. And so he turns and he rebukes the demon that is inside this slave girl and exorcises the demon from the slave girl. And the girl no longer can tell the future or tell fortunes after this. Well, this causes a little bit of a problem because money's involved now. These slave owners who once had a lucrative business on their hands because of this young girl, they no longer can make the money that they were making. And so they take Paul and they drag him before the magistrate and they accuse him of all these things causing problems in the city. So the magistrate puts him in jail. And at night, while they're in jail and they're locked up, an earthquake happens. And all the gates of the prison cells come open and their chains fall off and they're sitting there free. They could go. When the jailer comes in the morning, he sees the situation. He sees that all the cells are open and he immediately thinks, oh, well, this is not going to go good for me. I lost all those put in my charge. I'm going to be tortured by the Roman Empire, so I might as well just off myself here. And so he takes his sword out and he's about to kill himself, but somehow Paul knows what he's going to do, and Paul yells out to him, "Don't do anything to yourself. We're all here." And so the jailer comes in and he sees that every single one of the prisoners that was in his charge are still there. And somehow Paul and Silas and Timothy had convinced everybody to stay. Maybe they were praying and sharing the gospel and singing hymns and nobody wanted to leave. I don't know. But when they get there, when the jailer gets there, Paul immediately is in evangelism mode. And the jailer says to him, "How can I be saved?" Now, for the jailer, when he asks how he can be saved, he's not thinking about a religious conversion or a religious salvation. He's simply thinking, how can I get out of this mess? Here I am, I'm in the charge of you all, and I'm supposed to be keeping you safe, and I'm supposed to be keeping you in protective custody or in custody and waiting for your trials. And here we are, I've been shown to be incompetent. I wasn't even here, and you could have all escaped. If word gets out, I'm going to be in real danger. So when he's asking about salvation, he's kind of asking Paul desperately, how do I get out of this mess that I've got myself into? And Paul, of course, begins to preach the gospel to him, something that he wasn't expecting to hear. But as soon as he hears Paul share the gospel with him, he believes. And he gets actually baptized right there, and he's washing Paul and the others from their wounds from when they had been beaten and hurt and just from being dirty from the road. And Paul baptizes them, and it's likely there wasn't any other water around. And so the baptism might have occurred with that very same water that the jailer and his family had been ministering to Paul and Silas and Timothy, and he used that water to baptize the jailer. So after this, they leave Philippi, but before they leave Philippi, they make sure that the magistrate knows who they are. And so Paul begins to play a card that he had kept hidden up to this point. And And he says, you go tell your magistrate that I'm very disappointed. Is this the way they treat Roman citizens? And so the magistrate, hearing that he was a Roman citizen and that they had beaten him and put him in prison without any trial, they immediately become fearful because that was not okay behavior to be acted upon a Roman citizen. And so they immediately began to try and cover it over, and they ask Paul to quietly leave, but Paul makes a big deal about it and makes them apologize, and then he leaves the city. They head down to Thessalonica and they spend just a few weeks there, yet they are able to set up a church and begin to teach the leadership. There's some problems that arise later. You see in the letter to the Thessalonians that arises because Paul wasn't there long enough to teach them about certain things, but he gets to clear it up through letters and sending Timothy and Silas back into the churches there to strengthen them. From Thessalonica, they go on to Berea. Now, up until this point, Paul has always experienced kind of a moderate success. Some people believe, but in large part, most people don't believe his message, and he ends up getting in trouble because of the message he's preaching. But when he gets to Berea, the Jewish community there seems to be more open and receptive to what Paul's preaching. So they listen to him. They listen to him share his message about how Jesus impacted him on the road and how Jesus showed us and has proved himself to Paul to be the Messiah that Israel's hoped for. And as they listen to this message, they do the thing that's most prudent. They go to the scriptures themselves and they test Paul's message against the prophecies and the things that they had been taught all their lives. And they see that his message is true, and many of the Bereans begin to believe. So Paul then moves on from Berea and he decides to go south into Athens. Now, Paul, having grown up in Tarsus, probably always wanted to visit Athens. We don't know if he had been able to go there before this, but he probably always wanted to visit Athens. And so as he enters into Athens, you were going to see that some of his training, some of his experiences from the past are going to play very well there. And he's going to head down southwest even more into Corinth. And we'll look at that in the next video.